It's good to see you.
All right, folks,
I'm
we're
okay
going
with
to get started. A very warm welcome to all of you here in the room in Washington, and including our, I think, record-breaking online audience as well. I can't imagine why there's such interest in this particular individual. My name is Brian Finlay. I'm the President and CEO here at the Stimson Center. It's a great honor for us to have you, and I thank you all for joining us. We're going to have a lot of fun here today. It's a special event to us for a number of reasons. First, this is the formal relaunch of our Chairman's Forum series. Some of you may be familiar with that. It took a hiatus over the pandemic, but we're really pleased to be relaunching it here today. It is a long-running forum that is a unique conversation. It's an opportunity to bring senior-level individuals from government, recently retired government, from the NGO sector, from the private sector, together for really a different type of conversation where we set the politics aside and we really just investigate and interrogate big transnational challenges that we face as a country and we face as a global community. Second, I'm equally pleased to, for the very first time, be introducing you all to someone who probably needs no introduction to this group or to our colleagues online, the chairman of our board. He is a very familiar face to you. Hawk Carlyle comes to us as the chairman of our board after a distinguished 4-decade-long career in service to the nation as a career Air Force officer. He's a remarkable asset to us here at Stimson, and we're really proud to have him chairing our board of directors. Hawk is going to lead the conversation here today with General Raymond. I note that this is the General's very first appearance publicly after recently stepping down from active duty himself after what has been a remarkable career as well. General, it's an honor to have you join us here at Stimson, and I thank both of you gentlemen for your service to the country. Finally, a big word of thanks to our colleagues at Peraton for facilitating this conversation. Mara Motherway, Scott, very pleased to have you here today, and thank you again for your generous support of this forum. And with that, General, the floor is yours, sir.
Brian, thank you very much. Everybody here okay? And I assume we're good online? Excellent, thank you. It's great to be here. Good morning. It's great to have everyone here. Let me reiterate to Peraton, Scott, Mara, thank you very much. We can't tell you how much we appreciate your support in this, so thanks for being here. And thanks for your incredible support. It's wonderful to have everybody here. I think this will be a great conversation. Jay Raymond and I have known each other for, well, some of you weren't born when we first met, if that tells you anything. So it's great to have what I think is one of the finest gentlemen I've had the good fortune to work with and know in my life, Jay Raymond here. Incredible career in the Air Force, then the Space Force. He graduated from the Harvard of the South, which is Clemson, in case anybody didn't know that. So he'll reiterate that a lot of times. Yeah. Got commissioned a missile officer originally in the United States Air Force, and then, as often happened at that time, transitioned to a space officer and was incredible. His career in space commanded at squadron group, wing, numbered Air Force level across the entire Space Force in some of the most critical positions. Deployed to the Middle East as a director of Space Forces for Afghanistan and Iraq, which incredibly rewarding, I know, from Jay's perspective. He was also the vice commander of 5th Air Force in Japan during Operation Tomodachi, which was a tsunami and the earthquake and tsunami in Japan. And my Japanese friends, I spent a lot of time in Japan as well, still refer to him kind of godlike. So they consider Jay an incredible man. So at the time there, he was an op step for the United States Air Force, which the A3, and fixed everything that I got wrong when I was the A3. And then his command of U.S. or Air Force Space Force, Air Force Space, and then the transition in a couple of different iterations, and we'll get a chance to hear some of that. Air Force Space, he was Air Force Space and stood up the combatant command simultaneously, so he had two hats, and then stood up U.S. Space Force as the very first Chief of Space Operations, the very first CSO in the history of this country, which is remarkable. There's not many people, I think, that have stood up a service by themselves since 1947, to be exact. So let's, if you don't mind, Jay, we'll kind of start with that. So standing up a service, what was it like? Can you give us a little, I know that's a broad question.
It's a broad question. First of all, Hawk, it's great to be here with you. Thanks. Hawk invited me actually before I retired and agreed to do this, and this is the one event that I'm doing in my kind of my post-retirement cool down for a little bit. But I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. You know, you said stood up by myself. First of all, I had a great team, and we have a great team. We have a great group of space professionals in all services that come to work every day, really focused on giving our nation what it needs. And I was proud to serve at their side. It started, though, on the 20th of December 2019. The National Defense Authorization Act was signed. That basically was the birth certificate for the Space Force, and in it said there is a thing called a Space Force, and it was activated that night upon signature. And that same evening, I was appointed as the CSO. And I remember getting on an airplane flying back to Peterson in Colorado Springs, which is where I lived. And you get the excitement of the moment, and then, you know, about a half hour in, I'm like, okay, now it's now we gotta produce
something.
And so what I started thinking through was what are the things that an independent service needed to do as an independent service, and kind of use that as the outline to manage the work that we were doing, and came up with 5 or 6 things. First of all, I thought a service needed to develop its own people, and so we started out focusing on, you know, at the time on the 20th of December, there was only one person in the Space Force, and that was me, and we had to bring the rest in. So we had to build all the processes to get people to come in, but at the same time, we wanted to do things differently and think differently and be bold in our thinking. So it was kind of like being a marathon runner and a sprinter at the same time. You had to put in the processes, which required a lot of work, but we also wanted to develop new thought. So we did that on the personal side. You had to have your own budget. And so initially we took the dollars that the Air Force had for space and brought that in. And we've had a couple budgets since then that now are Space Force budgets that have been produced by the Space Force team under the Department of the Air Force. We wanted to have our own doctrine. The Air Force had their own doctrine in 1947. I think it was daylight strategic bombing at the time out of the Air Corps Tactical School. And so a group of Guardians got together on their own and wrote the first ever independent theory of doctrine called space power. The other thing I thought we needed to do was to design our force. And that was both organizationally and force structure-wise. So organizationally, our desire was to be able to be very lean and move at speed and be able to go fast, because the demands of the domain, which is a very vast domain, with operations happening at 17,500 miles an hour, just to stay in space, you had to be able to make decisions fast. And so we flattened the organizational structure, made mission-focused commands on consolidating, for example, space-based and ground-based missile warning under one 06 command, where it used to be split up between 2 different wings. And so we focused on getting the organizational piece right. And then the next big part of force design was shifting the on-orbit force structure, pivoting that force structure to be a more resilient force structure to a growing threat. We have the world's best space capabilities, without a doubt. They're exquisite. They're very large, they're expensive, and they're not easily to defend. They're really built for a different domain. And so what we wanted to do was be able to capitalize on commercial industry, capitalize on international partners, and to be able to diversify the on-orbit portfolio, if you will, just like you do with your financial portfolio. So if one stock goes bad, you don't go broke. We wanted to be able to diversify the on-orbit portfolio to, one, be able to better accomplish the mission, and 2, be able to protect from a growing threat. Then once you design that force, you have to ready that force. And so we really worked hard to change the readiness calculus. Traditionally, we had measured our readiness against a benign domain, and that's not the domain that we found ourselves in. And so we worked to shift that readiness. And once you ready the force, you have to be able to present that force to combatant commands. And so we primarily present our forces, Space Force presents their forces to U.S. Space Command, and we stood up an organization called the Space Operations Command that is the service component to U.S. Space Command. But just, I think it's a week or so ago now, the Space Force has stood up their first component command out at INDOPACOM, which again gets to integration amongst all the geographic combatant commands and all the combatant commands, which is so important. There's nothing we do as a joint force that isn't enabled by space, and that integration is key.
Excellent. I got to tell you, the Guardian name, I like it. When you first build a new name, I guess no matter what happens, you're going to kind of think about it. But it really, in my opinion, has grown on me to say soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Guardians, and Coast Guardsmen. It's a pretty easy statement, but I like the name. So
Thank you. We worked hard on that name. I think we took, don't quote me on the numbers, there was like 700 different inputs. We crowdsourced this. We had linguists come up, try to make up names that might work. I mean, we tried
covered the spectrum.
And what we came up with, I think, really fits the mission. It's something that the Guardians are proud of. And it also links back to the history of Air Force Space Command. The Air Force Space Command back in 1982, the motto was the Guardians of the High Frontier. And so it linked into that. The Space Command published a magazine every month called Guardians of the High Frontier, and it had a link to history. It described what we thought the mission that the Guardians do, and we're pretty proud of that as well.
I like it. Kind of getting to one point you brought up there, and you and I in our time in the Air Force, we went through a few space commissions that studied space, and I think the two things that continually came out of every commission that ever happened reference space was there were really two things that you needed to do to make space better for the United States and national security. And they really boiled down to space acquisition. How do you do that? It was a different animal when I was still in uniform, and you altered that. So I'd really like to hear your opinion on how we're doing on space acquisition and making that at speed, lean, and the things we need to do. And then the other part was it's got to be part of the joint integrated fight and not a standalone, not an afterthought, which frankly for a period of time it was. Not through anybody's fault, it's just as a developing domain. So kind of on those two fronts with the stand-up of the U.S. Space Force, how are we doing on space acquisition and integration into the joint fight?
That was one of the key topics of debate or conversation over many, many years on what the organization structure of national security space should be. And it was because one of the big things was acquisition, as you said. Some of the points that were pointed out were that, if I recall correctly, there were 60 different people that could say no, and there was no single person that could say yes when it dealt with space acquisition. There was talk about that we were building satellites and didn't have the ground to be, the terminals to be able to communicate with those satellites. There was lack of integration. And so we worked hard on that. We did a couple of things. When we did our organizational design, we retooled what was the Space and Missile Systems Center out in Los Angeles and made it Space Systems Command. And I think that has proved valuable in the way that we organize that. The other thing that I realized pretty early on is you can't tackle the problem just going at acquisition. It starts before that. Right. And so we really worked hard on what we call force design. And if you have a handful of very exquisite, very highly complex satellites, that drives a different business model. And if you have multiple satellites of less exquisite, you can then adopt different practices. And so this force design work is absolutely critical. And the National Defense Authorization Act of last year, after we did the analysis, the first force design we worked on was the missile warning, missile tracking force design. After we did that analysis, the Congress actually said the space we put in law, Space Force will be the force design architect for across the department. And the Secretary of Defense wrote a memo to that effect. And so that was really key. Once you have the force design, then you have to have requirements. And again, if you have a different force structure, the requirements conversation is different. When you elevate from a major command in the Air Force to a service chief, the service chief's role in requirements, as you know, as being the head requirement guy for the Air Force, gets elevated pretty significantly. And so in the JROC actually wrote a memo that said the Space Force is now the lead integrator for joint space requirements. Another big step forward.
That's huge.
And so on both the force design work and the requirements work, and then the restructure of Space and Missile Systems Center all played into helping with that. The other couple big things that happened in the law, when the National Defense Authorization Act was signed that established the Space Force, it said there will be an Assistant Secretary for Space Acquisition and Integration. We now have that. And it also said that official will be a separate SAE for space. And we now have that, and that's in Frank Covelli, who's in that job. And so that has already proven pretty significant. And then it also changed what was called the Space Force Acquisition Council to the Space Acquisition Council, which again helped bring that integration together across multiple services. So I'm not here to say we finished all that and that everything is fixed and perfect, but I will tell you we have made huge strides, and I'm really, really happy with where we've landed so far.
That's excellent.
And we've got a great team in place. The Space Force has a great team in place to be able to continue to refine that.
One of the things I think it appears it has become very evident that Space Force is able to do, especially as a standalone, domain-centric on space, and its ability to interact with the other domains, is work with national security space. In other words, the D&I part of it. And I assume that, most of the NRO officers were airmen. I assume most of them are now guardians, would be my guess. But did you feel like that interaction with the D&I and the rest of the national security space
it's been a significant benefit of establishing an independent service. We, very early on, became the 18th member of the intelligence community, which gives us a stronger voice at the table for intelligence requirements. And so that has happened.
That's huge.
And then we have our own S2 that's doing, that serves the intel needs for the Space Force and integrated into those 18 members. So I think it has been one of the big advantages. We also stood up, and I talked about our organizational structure. We in the Air Force, as you know, there was 5 layers of command. There was a major command, a numbered Air Force command, so a 4-star, a 3-star, a wing command, which is a colonel, a group command, which is a colonel, and then a squadron command, which is a lieutenant colonel. We got rid of 2 of those layers, and so we have a 3-star, what we call field command, and then there's only 106 command. We call that the Delta command, and that is a mission-focused Delta. We stood up a Delta just on intelligence, and then we put intelligence debts at the other Deltas and have intelligence professionals sitting side by side with our operators, which has really helped up our game as well. We were working.
I was going to say, you and I are the ones that actually, if I remember correctly, it was about 500 billets from Air Combat Command to go to space, Air Force space, because you hadn't grown up with any intel. I mean, I think, some people, I got to admit, I take a little offense, and people will complain that the Air Force didn't, the reason we needed a separate Space Force is the Air Force didn't take care of Space Force. And I've had people finger in my chest saying, yeah, you fighter guys took all the Space Force money and all the satellite money to build fighters, which you and I both know is blatantly false. But when you think about it, as the domain stood up, it was benign, it was large systems that were unchallenged, it wasn't congested, it wasn't competitive, all those things. And if you think about it, and you and I lived through this, until 2016, 2017, you couldn't even say space war fighting. because you couldn't talk about space as a warfighting domain, even though everybody knew it was. And in 2007, January, I think it was, when the Chinese shot down their own weather satellite, all of a sudden we collectively went, well, they're serious, we better be. And you did incredible work in that decade till we could actually start moving forward. But so I don't think it was, you know, I think it was an evolution in that the Air Force did great with space, and, you know, the Bernie Shrievers and the, you know, there's some greats that just lost General Harmon, which was another, in my opinion, one of the greatest. So I think the Air Force did a great job with space, but it was the right time to make it a standalone. So,
and I think it is absolutely proven to be the right answer. There's no argument that we are in a better posture today than we were. And I will also tell you, the Air Force, I think 1 + 1 in this case equals 5, not 2. I think the Air Force is actually better too. Yeah. Because the Air Force can now sharpen its focus on the domains that it's responsible, its core competencies, yeah. And that combination of a better postured Space Force with an Air Force, I think, really provides a really important capability to our national defense, which is so important to integrated deterrence, which is the foundation of the national defense strategy. I really believe that this has proven to be the absolute right answer, and I think we're both better for it.
Yeah, I agree. And certainly, I think it's borne out in the way things are developing as we go forward. Kind of the other part of that, and I got to tell you, I'm really impressed that we stood up a Space Force component in Indo-PACOM, so the integration into the joint warfight and how the Space Force has moved that forward.
It goes back to those principles that I talked about up front. That was the kind of our homework that we gave ourselves, a presentation of forces. When the Air Force presented forces when the Air Force was responsible for space, we presented forces through the air component. You mentioned that I served as the director of Space Forces in theater. And so I was an 06 that went forward and worked for the air component commander. In my time, it was General Gary North, and I helped him execute what we called Space Coordinating Authority. Well, today the Air Force isn't responsible for space. It falls under the Department of the Air Force, but it's not under the service isn't responsible for it. So we had to have the ability to present forces into theater, and I think it's the foundation of integration into joint warfighting. We've seen that in warfighting, and we've also seen that, as you mentioned, in humanitarian assistance disaster relief with Operation Tomodachi, where we integrated space into that as well. Right. So I really believe it's a great step forward for the service.
And you're going to have a service component at each one of the combatant commands. That is the intent as you go forward?
That's the intent. Again, that's General Saltzman, who is the CSO, who's an incredibly bright officer, incredible leader, will lead that effort, but that's the intent.
That was, I got to say, having known Salty for a long time, seeing that announcement, and then obviously the change of command, he's the right guy.
He's the right guy.
He is the right person at the right place at the right time to be CSO too.
I'm really proud of the team. We've got a great team. As I told the team back a few years ago, if we can't get this done with the team that we have, with the officers that we have, went through weapons school, went through SAS, gave all the training. We were waiting for them to get to the level where they could be general officers. Well, now they're here, and they've all grown up together. They all work well together, and the Space Force has a really powerful leadership team, and I couldn't be happier with where they are.
One other thing, and I'll kind of go to two questions, then we can. I know I'm taking a lot of time, but it's my prerogative. So it's
the chairman's forum.
Yeah, it's the chairman's forum. That's right, and I'm sure Brian will give me the hook when he wants me to stop talking. So we all know that we as a nation will never fight alone. Friends, partners, and allies, which is an asymmetric advantage we have over any potential adversaries out there who don't have friends, partners, and allies, and building those relationships. But on the space front, as you said, the United States is exquisite. We have the best, but we have some incredibly capable partners. So integration with the joint partners, not joint partners, the combined partners are friends, partners, and allies. I think Space Force has moved that forward.
That's another key area, partnerships in the space business is critical. And again, as you said, that's an advantage for our nation. We have incredible partners, and we have worked very hard over the course of the last, well, probably for a decade, but really sharpened that focus here over the last several years on increasing our ability to work with our international partners. And what historically has been largely data sharing partnerships, we have now really shifted to partnerships where we operate together, we train together, we exercise together, we war game together. We're building capabilities together for the first time. We're putting hosted payloads on Norwegian satellites. We're putting hosted payloads on Japanese satellites. It's really significant. And it gets to, the Secretary of Defense in the Secretary of Defense's National Defense Strategy. Integrated deterrence is the foundation of that strategy, and this is central to that integrated deterrence. I want to be very clear that we do not want to get into a conflict that begins or extends into space. We want to deter that from happening. And these international partnerships that we have really matured, and is going to provide our nation great advantage.
Yeah, that's great news, and I think that's that's an asymmetric advantage, especially when you think about the Japanese being one, the Australians have great capability. We've worked with them back in the WGS days, and growing that relationship even more is incredibly important. So kind of on that same note, the proliferation, the congested, proliferated low Earth orbit, what that's going to look like, what Starlink is doing around the world. So the work between national security space and commercial space, that line is blurred significantly. So
I think
thoughts on that?
Historically, what has been commercially viable are large communication satellites and launch. And largely because of commercial launch, the barriers to entry into space have been reduced. And so what used to be great power competition between us and the Soviet Union at the time, now you have students launching satellites. And now that we've gone, you mentioned proliferated LEO, now that technology has enabled smaller satellites to be more operationally relevant, and you can get them into orbit for a cheaper price and more responsibly, you then open up a significant amount of more missions that are now commercially viable. Right. And I think we will continue to see the value of that to many nations across the globe.
And as far as I know, you and I have had this discussion, but folks like the relationship between us and those commercial enterprises, the Elon Musk and Bezos of the world, is actually really good in how
we talked about international partners being a strategic advantage for our nation. Our commercial industry is a strategic advantage for our nation. And we are working very closely to have a very close relationship with the commercial industry. It's a good problem to have, and this is a terrible word to use in space, but this explosion of commercial space things happening. We really, I think it's going to provide, it's going to help us, it'll help us make that pivot to a more proliferated architecture. Right. And to do it in a way that we can do it at speed and at a reduced cost.
And that also makes us more resilient, and if God forbid we ever did extend a war in space, it becomes a more resilient architecture because of the Right. commercial and the allies and us all working together, where an adversary couldn't take out a capability because it was too proliferated across the architecture and domain.
It would be way more difficult.
Yeah. You mentioned it, but I'd like to just give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about it. And I will tell you, from one of the most frustrating things in the United States Air Force was personnel. It is a challenge, although I have to admit that having now retired for a few years, as bad as the Air Force personnel system is, there's companies that have just as bad and challenging personnel systems. That's not a pejorative statement, but so your new approach, I think you did some things that you learned from your time in the Air Force not to do. So you want to talk a little bit more about your people development?
So when we first started, huddling with the team, we figured there was kind of two risks. the first risk was that we wouldn't be bold enough in our thinking. We would just kind of walk the dog and down the path and continue to do business the same way we've always done business. And then the second risk was that if we did think bold, or when we thought bold, that we might not be able to get it implemented because of the bureaucracy that would say, hey, that's not how we do business.
Right.
And so our push was be bold. Just, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. Don't, build a service for today. And if you look at the numbers of people that we have in the Space Force, that are in the Space Force, I'm a month old, so don't quote me on the numbers, but it's roughly, by the end of this year, about 8,400 active duty Guardians, and roughly about an equal number of civilians. It's about a 50-50 split, which is also different for our service than other services. We have the Space Force has more of a...
And those are GS civilians?
Right.
Right.
So with 8,400 people, and I mentioned this I was at a conference here recently before retiring, Air Force Leadership Conference. As you recall, in PACAF, Kadena, the wing at Kadena, is huge.
Yeah, about 11,000 people.
11,000 people in one wing. 8,400 people, you can know everybody. In the personnel business, I learned this from previous bosses, there's kind of an art and there's a science. And the science is the machine takes over and says, Hawk, you're going here, and Jay, you're going here, and so-and-so, you're going here, and that's where the machine puts you. In a small service, you can apply more art, and you can have a little bit, you can develop your people differently, and that's what we're trying to do with the Space Force. In the Space Force, we published something called the Guardian Ideal, which at its root all boils down to 8,400 people. You can apply more art, and it goes into many aspirational things that we wanted to try to get done. But I really believe that that when this thing materializes and we get the Guardian Ideal, it's never going to be complete. You're always going to work towards this ideal.
Right.
But I really believe it will be a model for others to emulate, because we're going to use current century personnel development practices.
Right.
And I'm very proud of the team that put all that together.
Are you finding that the recruitment side, I know that is there coming out of the academies and coming out of ROTCs?
Out everywhere. So the other thing is, and there's been news that there's a recruiting challenge. We haven't seen that in the Space Force, and it's a different. I don't want it to say that we're better than other services. It's different. We only recruit several hundred a year rather than thousands and thousands and
Right.
thousands. So it's an easier challenge. But I will tell you, we have more people knocking on our door than we can take. And what we've done is we've changed the recruiting. So the way we recruit enlisted Guardians is that we put some space experience recruiters in certain Air Force recruiting offices. And if somebody came in and said they wanted to do space, they'd say, yeah, here, do space. And we kind of took the first 300. I said, well, why are we doing that? Why don't we say, on 1 January, for example, say, hey, we're hiring 300 people this year. Do you think they're good enough? Apply. And so what we did, we didn't quite get there, but what we've done is we use the recruiters now to get the pool of people. We bring them in and we do assessments on them, and then we have a board and we pick which ones are coming in. And the quality of our folks, and not that we were bad before, but the quality of our folks, both on the enlisted side and the officer side, has gone through the roof. On the Air Force Academy, when we were under the Air Force, we'd get about, there's roughly 1,000 people in a class. We'd get about 30. The very first year, so we stood up in December. In April, that class graduated because of COVID. We graduated them a little early. We got 86. The next year, 116.
Wow.
The next year, about the same. We're trying to say about 100 is where we want. Then we're going to get. We got one out of the Naval Academy this year. What we'd like to do was get about 100 out of the Air Force Academy, a couple out of West Point, a couple out of the Naval Academy, and then the rest in ROTC. And we've built university partnership programs with, don't quote me on the number of schools, with a certain number of schools, I think it's 16, that we now have a direct partnership with for both research and students,
Wow.
both on the officer side and on the civilian side. So
Wow.
we've also taken folks, this year we're bringing in the Space Force is bringing in 6 cyber professionals that were in industry, and we had hundreds apply, and we took 6, and we brought them in. The first one that came in as our first lieutenant, and one that I think is coming in as a lieutenant colonel, based on how much experience they had in industry that we gave
So
them
you're
credit.
direct assessing them
Direct
into
assessing.
those ranks.
And we're expanding that. It started with cyber. We're expanding that to all the other career fields as well. And we've also looked at, could you take somebody that might not, for example, at the Air Force Academy, I think it's 2 years ago now, there was and he's given me permission to talk about this, so I'm not violating any HIPAA rules or anything, but there's a gentleman that in his, I think it was his junior, was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And we've never assessed a type 1 diabetic into the military before. Well, in the Space Force, you can have a career from second lieutenant to 4-star, living in Colorado Springs, Denver, Florida, Washington, D.C., or L.A. I mean, you don't have to go to remote places. And so we'll take him. And so a couple days before he was graduating, got commissioned, we got approval, and now he's in our force. We just took our second one, a highly educated Duke engineer plus Harvard lawyer, Harvard Law School graduate. And so I bring that up to just say, again, because of the nature of our force, the numbers and locations and where we do our missions, you might be able to have, what might not be acceptable for another service might be perfectly acceptable for a Space Force. And so that's another example of where we're trying to think differently.
That, I got to say, that's something that I think the other services can learn from. And not just how you assess, but how you manage them. We had folks that loved the Air Force, didn't want to get out, but elderly parents, childbirth, continuous education. So it sounds like you're able to be bold and be able to do some of those things from the birth of your service. Hopefully that'll translate to some of our other services over
there's
time.
still work. There's still work to do, but we're making some. The Space Force is making some good initial steps, and that's the vector that they're on.
That's fantastic to assess like that. And those are they'll be line of the Space Force kind of folks.
Right.
Like the lieutenant colonel is the line of the Space Force kind of guy.
Right.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, so we only brought, the folks that we brought into the Space Force are in 5 careers: operations, intelligence, engineering, acquisition, and cyber. All the support functions, medical, lawyers, civil engineers, logisticians, that's all in the Air Force. And that's why it's so important that we're integrated under the Department of the Air Force, because we rely heavily on the Air Force for all those support functions. Secretary Kendall, who I have a ton of respect for, has a motto, 1 team, 1 fight. And that's really important because, again, 1 + 1, the Space Force and Air Force equals way more than 2.
Right.
And having that relationship and getting the support folks out of the Air Force we can't do our business
Right.
without. And so we've been able to focus on just, put a sharp focus on mission, which is why it was so important that we set up the Space Force to begin with.
Yeah, that's impressive. The whole's greater than the sum of the parts, so that's definitely true. One last question, then I'll open it up. So Space Command, the 11th Combatant Command, which I think, in my opinion, was overdue.
Right.
We had it, and we lost it, and it came back. And the reason it stood down in the fall of the Soviet Union, a bunch of reasons. But so the interaction between Space Force and Space Command, how's that? Is it developing the way you want it to?
Absolutely.
Do you see it moving the right way?
It's normal in that you have the way the Department of Defense is with Goldwater Nichols, there's kind of 2 functions. One is organized, train, equip functions, which is what services do, and one is a a warfighting function, which is what combatant commands do. There's different focuses. The combatant command focuses, and I having served as both at the same time, I lived this. You know,
cup of coffee with yourself in the morning.
Yeah, I had a little conversation with myself, and I you know, in my combatant command hat, I was near-term focused. In my service hat, you're thinking you're building a force for the future. And in my COCOM hat, I yelled at myself and argued against myself in my service, and I won. But it's normal relationships, and I think having both of those functions in space are critical, and having a very strong U.S. Space Command and a very strong Space Force is what our nation needs.
Yeah, no, and Jim Dickinson's a great guy, doing some great work out there. So I know he's about ready to. I think that is going to happen next summer sometime, potentially. Unknown. Okay, well, thanks. Let me open it up to questions. I'd love to ask Mara if she has a question for Jay.
Oh, great. Thank you. Really appreciate you being here today and this being your debut post-returement. So thanks so much.
I'm going back to.
You're going back
I'm going back to.
He's going underground
All
after
right.
this. So
Okay,
you
so
won't
it's just
do it
a
first.
one night only. So you talked about all the positive attributes for commercial space, the innovation and the strategic advantage that it creates for our nation and for military and national security space. Can you talk about some of the challenges that you've seen and what you might anticipate in the future?
Thanks for that softball. I think, you know, it's interesting. When I was a young captain in the Air Force, I worked at Air Force Space Command, and my duty title was the Chief of Commercial Space Operations. I was the commercial space guy for Air Force Space Command. And at that time, in the early 90s, there was somewhat similar to what we see today. There was proliferated low Earth orbit constellations being thought through: Iridium, Teledesic, Global Star, and there were some others. And at that time, we were giving excess capacity to commercial companies. So we lease property to build a payload processing center at Vandenberg. We lease or license space launch pads so they could do commercial launches. Companies were building small rockets to do replenishment of kind of, on these big proliferated constellations, replenishment one at a time, you know, sending a satellite up or a couple satellites up. And so they're building small rockets. They needed a place to process payloads, and they needed launch pads. And so we were given excess property of that. Today, if you look at the manifest, I mean, if you look at the manifest so in 2005, I was the ops group commander at Vandenberg, in charge of operations at the Western Range. I was the range ops group commander. And our sister range at the Cape, I think between the two of those, between the two, we did less than, and it was a busy year at that time, we did less, I think, don't quote me on the numbers, there's less than 60 launches. Today, combined, today in the Cape, they're doing 60-something launches, and Vandenberg is, I think totally we're in the high 80s. Projections have that maybe in the next few years we're doing a launch a day. I mean, this last year we've done launches within 13 hours of each other. And so the demand that we see from commercial it's a great benefit to us. It really helps us reduce launch costs, helps us have assured access to space, but it puts a demand on the units that are supporting it. That's one. The other thing is our business practices of the department don't align probably as easily with commercial businesses. You know, so it takes me 2 years. It took me. I got to get used to past tense. I'm a nobody now, but
join the club.
And you know, if I want to get money for a program, it takes 2 years to get dollars. And so being able to synchronize DoD processes with commercial processes is an area that is going to continue to be a focus for the department and specifically for the Space Force, so we can best leverage that.
I think speed is part of that, you know, and the Congress is never gonna give the Department of Defense a checkbook and go, hey, go invest in what you think's gonna work. If a couple fail, that's okay, which is the way, obviously, industry and private equity has the ability to do things at a pace. So we gotta figure out how to get better at that as we go forward, so. Sandra?
Thank you,
Thank
General
you, Sandra.
Raymond. Thanks for doing this. Sandra Irwin with Space News. On your point about the Space Force standing up a Indo-PACOM component, obviously the concern there is China. So I was wondering if you think that the Space Force right now has enough capability to track space activities, potentially understand what's hostile, what's not hostile, have attribution and things that they would need, that Indo-PACOM would need to be able to decide if this is a real threat. Do they have enough capability to do that, or is it something that the Space Force has to continue to invest going forward?
Yeah, so we're the best in the world in space, Sandra. I mean, clearly the best in the world in space. And, but as the domain continues to change, the need for domain awareness is going to continue. We're going to have to make sure that our capabilities continue to evolve to meet the changing space environment. But I will tell you, I'm very comfortable today that between the capabilities that we have in the Space Force and under the authorities of the combatant command, I'm very comfortable today that we can do what our nation needs us to do. The reason why we set up a Space Force and the reason why we set up a Space Command was to be able to go fast to stay ahead of that. And I think with these two organizations now up, I'm comfortable that we'll be able to do that in the future as well.
So you don't think there's any gaps in space domain awareness?
Oh, I didn't say that. There's gaps to be had, but I'm comfortable that we can do what our nation needs to do, and there'll need to be continued investment.
So we've got a couple of questions from outside, I think, and again, you know, in fairness to Jay, this is, you know, we can't talk any classified, any sensitive information, any things like that, so we'll stay well away from that. But, and I know you were part of this when it came out, was DoD did just release the annual report on China's military power. Is there anything that they're doing now that you can think of, China, that worries you the most?
I would just say, if I go on that space domain awareness, I would also say the department's investing in space domain awareness, and so we have you know, programs that we continue to invest, because that's clearly a foundational capability for operating in any domain, is having the ability to have awareness. On what China is or is not doing, what I would say is the thing that is concerning is the speed at which they're moving, and that's what I think really makes them the pacing challenge, as it is laid out in the National Defense Strategy.
Right. Yeah, at the end of the day, an autocracy has some benefits, some attributes that we don't have. Speed, government-owned, government direction, the ability to do things without any constraints whatsoever, which frankly it's an attribute. What they don't have is friends, partners, and allies. What they don't have is the innovative spirit of our guardians and things like that. So I couldn't agree more. One more question from the audience, and I'll kind of paraphrase this a little bit. So obviously, Russia demonstrated in the hypersonic capability. Space is obviously going to be a big player in that, and whether it's a boost glide, and not only offensively, but then defensively, how do you defend? Is your thoughts on Space Force?
The Space Force role in that is being able to detect and track threats from across the globe. I mean, that's one of the core competencies of what we do. That's the Guardians. I mean, hence our name.
Right.
We operate missile warning capabilities both in radars and in space to be able to detect anything that might threaten our country. As that threat evolves, our capabilities need to evolve. And so when I talked about the force design work that we did, the very first one that we did was on missile warning, missile tracking, to be able to better detect the emergent class of missiles and track them, and then at the same time being more resilient to a threat to those capabilities in space. So it's for two reasons. The Space Force part of that is being able to detect and track it and provide information to others to make warnings and assessments.
Right, very good. Sure.
You mentioned earlier,
We have an online audience, so we got to be cognizant of this.
thank you very much for this, for a fascinating presentation, really appreciate it. I'm interested in, you mentioned the partnerships with the commercial side and with our friends, partners, and allies. I'd be interested in your experience of constructing the partnership with NASA, and then where you see that going in the next 10 years.
You were just at the Artemis
Yeah,
launch, right?
we've got a great partnership with NASA. In a whole host of areas, we track the International Space Station and help protect that from collision of debris or other satellites in the congested nature of the main. We have NASA folks sitting on our ops center floors out of Vandenberg helping us, working closely with them to do that. We send Space Force folks to NASA to be astronauts. We have 2 Space Force colonels that are NASA astronauts. So when they go to NASA, they're not working for the Space Force, they're working with NASA, but they are NASA astronauts. We operate the launch ranges which NASA launches off of. And so as John Carlisle just said, I was down in Florida, I went on leave down to watch the Artemis launch. That was off of the range that the Space Force operates. Just think about when U.S. astronauts launched off of U.S. soil for the first time since the shuttle, just here, not that long ago. It was a commercial rocket it was a civil launch, a NASA launch on a commercial rocket on a DoD range. That fused partnership is critical. We also, I was down at NASA, and they had some great training capabilities. I said, boy, we could use some of that. And so they then redesigned them to then provide to the Space Force, which saved dollars and gave us some training capabilities that would be very, very valuable. So I'll tell you, Administrator Nelson is a dear friend. We work very closely together, and I think that's going to continue. And I'd like to congratulate NASA on the successes that they had. I mean, that launch was incredible. But if you look at what NASA has done here over the years, they've been on a really good trajectory, and I'm proud of that partnership.
General, my name is Stan Soloway. I've been around defense and defense reform for a long time, and I'm on the Defense Business Board now. You came and met with us in August, and we chatted a bit about the agility requirements for Space Force. Having been involved in and having a lot of bruises on my head that Hawk can probably share his experiences as well, around 2-step forward, 1-step back reforms and advances and transformation. You set up a force that absolutely needs a degree of agility and innovation that perhaps exceeds anything else we've ever seen in the military. Do you have any concerns, or how have you structured it to avoid a situation that we've seen too often where the bureaucracy, once you've sort of folded back in under the Air Force, ultimately tends to chew away at the innovation and the agility, and you get set back into sort of the traditional models because the bureaucracy is so strong? And do you have any concerns about the force being able to maintain that edge?
No, I don't. The question the way you asked the question, you said getting sucked back. I can't remember the exact terminology, but sucked back in the Air Force. The Air Force has been a huge supporter of us. There has been no. We would not be here today with having made as much progress as we made without the Air Force. And never once did I think the Air Force was hindering us in our ability to move at speed. I think there was some, as we stood up the service, the Department of the Air Force had to learn how to operate with 2 services. I mean, there's natural things. But I am not concerned with the Air Force bureaucracy. That Secretary Kendall is, focused on imperatives to get after the China fight. Space is a critical part of that. It's well integrated into that. And if anything, we're moving pretty well at speed. I think it is hard to stand up a new organization in a large bureaucracy. especially when you're trying to push boundaries. And what I saw was in things that we could control, we made decisions like that. And things that required a broader conversation, it took more time. There's also some value in taking some time to make sure we get it right and not screwing it up, if you will. But I do believe that the Space Force is going to continue to push, and it has to work inside of a bureaucracy, and I think they're going to continue to be pushing on that to be able to continue to move at speed. And I think people realize we stood up a Space Force for a reason, and that was the need to be able to stay ahead. Again, we're the best in the world in space, but to stay ahead of that, and I think there's been pretty strong support. Hasn't been easy, but I think we've gotten pretty good, strong support. And on the Air Force side, there hasn't been, other than just normal figuring out how to operate with two services, there has been no bureaucratic slowdown from the Air Force by any means.
Please, last question, I think.
Hi, Trent Time. I'm one of the Loomis Council members here. Question I have is related to the cyber domain and the space domain and how they're overlapping. We see it going to protect that. And then the second part is any gaps or recommendations you would have for commercial space, because the intel community, the military have an entire force to protect those assets. As the pivot goes to commercial, how do you see that interaction and security going forward?
On the cyber side, that's another area that we have made some progress on. When we stood up, I talked about these mission-focused deltas. We also stood up a cyber delta. And we have put cyber operators, again, embedded with our other deltas. So we have cyber professionals that better understand now the cyber terrain of space that can help us protect and defend it. Again, don't want to say we've got this all solved, but we know where we're headed. We've got the structure in place, and I've seen significant strides forward on that front. On the commercial side, one of the interesting things is we've played with commercial in our war games. We have a war game called Shriva War Game, and we actually had commercial play with us, and we've learned a lot. I've played in that game. I played in the very first one back in early, I think it was like 2001 or 2.
Yeah.
And I played in multiple ones throughout the years, and commercial has really been helpful in that. One of the things that we did in that game was we stood up a commercial integration cell. And I was playing myself in a game, in a war game, which is a fascinating thing to do. And you're playing the game, and this commercial cell is just really providing great value. And then I went home to my real self, and something happened in the domain that I was like, hey, where's that commercial cell? We didn't have it. And so we worked with commercial industry, and we stood it up. And today that's up and operating and has continued to mature. But we've learned a lot in those games, and I think we'll continue to do that with commercial. As General Carlisle said, as commercial, more missions become commercially viable, and the blurring of commercial versus national security continues. And I think that's not just in space. I think it's across
certainly cyber and
a broader mission set. I think there's continued learning to be had, and we'll continue to work closely with commercial to do that.
Thank you. So the most critical question, the last one, is will Clemson beat North Carolina this
I
weekend?
hope so. I hope so.
The Harvard of the South's got to
Harvard of the
come
South.
through for us. So.
First, Hawk, thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. My wife thanks you as well, because after a month of being at home, she's like, okay, do you have to go TDY anywhere? So,
aren't you on the road soon? Yeah.
Don't you have to do something?
Well, that's going to be the way from now on, by the way.
But I appreciate the opportunity. Anything that I said, this was not Jay Raymond, this was the team. And we've got an incredible Space Force team. They've got an incredible leadership team in place. I'm very proud of that team. When I talk in the present case, I got to get used to I'm not that anymore. They've got a great team. They're going to do great things, and I'm proud of them. But I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thank you.
Well, Jay, we can't tell you how much we appreciate great, candid, open conversation. I think everyone here, I certainly learned, as I always do, every time I'm around you, I learned a ton just listening to your discussion. So thanks for doing it, and we want to wish you the best luck in the future. You will be relaxed. You'll look 10 years younger in no time. So we appreciate it. Let me thank one more time Peraton and Scott and Mara for the sponsorship. And I want to thank everyone for being here, and certainly the entire online audience. Thanks for being here. We really enjoyed this and look forward to the next Chairman Forum. But Jay, thank you very much.
Sure, thanks.
Thanks, brother.